Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a story that starts with something that sounds almost harmless, right? A man takes a tiny baby bird from its nest. But that one small decision ends up spiraling into this years-long legal battle, a pretty hefty fine, and a final verdict that honestly has something really important to say to all of us. Let's get into it.
I mean, it's a question we've all probably asked ourselves at some point. If you genuinely have no idea that you're breaking a rule, should you really be punished for it? It feels like a totally fair question. But, as you can imagine, in the eyes of the law, the answer is way more complicated than a simple yes or no. And this case, it puts that very idea to the ultimate test. So let's set this scene. Our main character is a man named Mr. Chuang. He's in his garden, he finds a baby Japanese white-eye bird, you might know it as a green-eye bird, and he takes it from its nest, thinking he'll care for it. Well, that one little act kicks off a chain of events that leads to a fine of about $2,000 and a really fascinating legal showdown. So here's a quick blow-by-blow of how this all went down. June 2022, Mr. Cheng takes the bird. About 5 months later, boom, he gets fined. He fights it, and in July 2023, he actually wins. The fine gets overturned. But wait, it's not over. The government appeals that decision, and in a final twist, the fine is put right back in place. So what on earth was going on in these courtrooms?
Okay, so let's get into the first act of this legal drama. It all centers on Mr. Chuang's plea of ignorance. He basically went to the lower court and said, look, I honestly just didn't know. And believe it or not, at first, that argument totally worked. So his defense team basically built this whole picture of him as a sympathetic guy. They argued, look, he's only got a primary school education. He wasn't trying to hunt the bird. He thought he was rescuing it. He was totally cooperative when the authorities showed up. He even claimed he had a tiff with a neighbor and was worried that if he just let the bird go, he'd get falsely accused of something else.
And you know what? The lower court judge bought it. This quote really gets to the heart of that first ruling. The judge looked at his limited schooling, how cooperative he was, and basically said, you know what? I believe him. It's totally plausible that this guy genuinely didn't know he was breaking the law. So, the court used a specific rule, Article 8 of Taiwan's Administrative Penalty Act, which is designed to allow for leniency when someone is truly ignorant of the law. And just like that, the fine was thrown out. For Mr. Chuang, this must have felt like the end of the story. But it wasn't.
And this is where our story takes a huge turn. The Taipei City Animal Protection Office, they weren't happy. They weren't satisfied with that decision at all. So they decided to appeal, taking this case about one little bird all the way to a higher court.
And you have to ask yourself, why? I mean, why spend all this time and all these resources to appeal a case like this? You've got a 63-year-old man, a single baby bird, a judge already showed him some mercy. Why push it?
Well, because for the government, this was never really just about the bird. It was about that huge question we started with. If I didn't know can just become a blanket excuse for anything, what does that do to the rule of law itself? They wanted to set a very clear precedent.
And that brings us to the final ruling, where the higher court came at this from a completely different direction. They focused on a really specific legal concept that changes everything, something called unawareness of illegality. Okay, so you can see right here how the two courts were just on completely different wavelengths. The lower court, on one hand, looked at Mr. Chuang's personal story, his education, his cooperation, and said, yeah, he didn't know the specifics of the Wildlife Conservation Act. But the higher court, they zoomed way out. They focused on his age, his general life experience. They didn't care if he could name the specific law. For them, the real question was, shouldn't he have had a general gut feeling that taking a wild animal from its nest was, well, wrong?
So let's break this down, because it's super important. Unawareness of illegality. The court basically explained that this isn't about being a lawyer. You don't need to be able to quote the law chapter and verse. It's about having a basic, fundamental sense that what you're doing is something society just doesn't allow. Think of it like this. It's the difference between not knowing the speed limit is 55 instead of 60 versus not knowing that you just can't drive your car through a crowded public park. To decide if Mr. Chuang's ignorance was a good enough excuse, the court used this kind of three-step test. It's actually pretty logical. First, you consider the person. What's their age, their life experience? Second, You ask, was there any reason for them to suspect they were doing something wrong? Any little voice that should have said, maybe this isn't okay. And third, if there was any doubt, did they have a responsibility to find out? To ask someone, maybe do a quick search?
And when they applied this test to Mr. Chuang's situation, well, the conclusion was totally different. The judge said that a 63-year-old man, no matter his formal education, has decades of social experience. Through news, TV, just being alive in society, he should have picked up on the basic idea that you don't just take wild animals. They ruled his ignorance was not unavoidable.
So we've gone from a nest in a garden all the way to a high court ruling. But what's the big takeaway here? Why should the rest of us care about this one case, about this one bird?
Because it all comes back to this number. The $60,000 fine was back on. The final message from the court was loud and clear. While there might be room for mercy in some cases, at the end of the day, ignorance of the law is not an excuse for breaking it.
So, what does this all mean for you and me in our day-to-day lives? Well, a few things. First, the law basically starts with the assumption that we all have a general moral compass. Second, your personal background might be taken into account, but it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Third, and this is the big one, not knowing the exact law number doesn't matter. And finally, this ruling puts the responsibility on us. If you're in a gray area, if you're not sure if something's okay, the law says it's your job to find out. And that really leaves us with this big lingering question, doesn't it? The court says it can presume that we all have a basic awareness of right and wrong. But as our world gets more and more complex, with more and more rules, is that always a fair assumption? It's a fascinating thought about where our personal responsibility ends and the complexity of modern life begins. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.